Hey guys, welcome back. Today's video is not fast, it's not loud, and it's not made to give you answers in 10 minutes. This is a long, slow journey into something most people don't even realize once existed or was once believed to exist. For most of human history, entire civilizations have disappeared, not because they were weak, not because they failed, but because the Earth itself changed. Oceans rose, land sank, maps were rewritten, and memories faded. We are taught that there are only 7 continents, that the surface of the Earth is fully understood, that no major landmass could simply vanish. But that belief is surprisingly recent, because less than 200 years ago, scientists believed something very different. They believed there was once a vast continent in the Indian Ocean, a land older than recorded history, a place that connected Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica. They called it Lemuria. This was not mythology. This was not religion. This was accepted science taught in universities. Then, without a single dramatic announcement, Lemuria slowly disappeared from textbooks, from maps, from public discussion. Today, even mentioning it sounds like fantasy. But here's the uncomfortable part. The questions Lemuria was created to answer never fully went away. Why identical species exist on distant continents? Why ancient cultures speak of drowned homelands? Why the ocean floor holds structures that don't fit simple explanations? This documentary is not here to convince you that Lemuria was real, and it's not here to tell you it wasn't. It's here to tell the complete story, how a scientific idea was born, how it spread, how it was replaced, and why it still refuses to die. We'll start in the 19th century, when geology was young and the world still had blank spaces. Then we'll follow Lemuria through science, myth, politics, and modern data. If you stay until the end, you won't be given a belief, but you may leave with better questions. This is the forgotten history of Lemuria. Before satellites revealed the true shape of the Earth, and before humanity possessed the tools to measure the ocean floor, the world was interpreted through assumption rather than certainty. Maps were not records of what was known, but expressions of what scholars believed must exist. In the centuries before modern geology, unexplored spaces were not left empty. Emptiness itself felt unscientific. Nowhere was this tendency stronger than across the vast and poorly understood Indian Ocean, a region so immense and silent that it invited speculation. European thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries believed the planet operated on principles of balance. If the northern hemisphere contained immense landmasses such as Europe, Asia, and North America, then logic suggested the southern hemisphere required an equal counterweight. A world lopsided with land on one side and water on the other seemed unreasonable. From this belief emerged the concept of a great southern continent known as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a hypothetical mass stretching across maps without proof, yet repeated so often it began to feel real. Cartographers drew it confidently, touching Africa, India, and distant Australia, not because they had seen it, but because it felt necessary for the Earth to make sense. The Indian Ocean in particular became a blank canvas for lost geography. Sailors reported sudden drops in depth near coastlines, strange coral formations rising from deep waters, and isolated islands scattered without apparent origin. 2. Early scientists. These observations hinted at submerged land, fragments of something once vast and continuous. At a time when the idea of moving continents did not exist, the notion that land could sink beneath the sea was not only plausible, but elegant. Science needed explanations, and sunken continents provided them. Throughout the early 19th century, naturalists faced a growing problem as they studied the distribution of life across the planet. Animals and plants appeared in places that defied logic. Species that should have shared a common route of migration were separated by oceans thousands of kilometers wide. Without an understanding of plate tectonics, scientists assumed continents were fixed permanently in place. If life appeared on distant shores with no clear path between them, the only solution was that land once connected those places and later disappeared. Lost land bridges became common theoretical tools, quietly accepted as part of serious scientific discourse. Among the most puzzling cases was a small primate native to Madagascar, the lemur. Lemurs existed abundantly on the island, yet closely related species and fossils were also found in India. The distribution made no sense. Lemurs could not swim across oceans, could not fly, and could not survive long-distance rafting. Africa lay between Madagascar and India. Yet lemurs were absent there. Evolutionary theory, still young and incomplete, struggled to explain this contradiction. In 1864, British zoologist Philip Lutley Sclater examined this mystery closely. Sclater was not a mystic or a fantasist. He was a respected scientist deeply involved in the study of animal geography. Observing the strange pattern of lemur distribution, he proposed a solution grounded in the scientific assumptions of his era. Sclater suggested that a large landmass once existed in the Indian Ocean, connecting Madagascar to India and possibly extending towards Southeast Asia. Across this land, animals and plants migrated freely. Over time, geological changes caused the land to sink, leaving behind isolated islands and severed biological connections. Sclater named this hypothetical continent Lemuria, not as a poetic flourish, but as a practical label derived from the animal that revealed its existence. When Lemuria entered scientific literature, it was not dismissed. It appeared in academic discussions, textbooks, and lectures. Many scientists regarded it as a reasonable explanation for unresolved evolutionary problems. Lemuria was never described as a paradise or an advanced civilization during this period. It was envisioned as forests, plains, rivers, and wildlife, a natural landmass that lived and died without witnesses. For several decades, Lemuria existed comfortably within mainstream science, supported not by direct evidence, but by necessity. The ocean floor remained inaccessible, and without the means to disprove the idea, Lemuria persisted as a useful hypothesis. Yet science does not tolerate uncertainty forever. As geological observations improved, questions began to surface. Coastlines appeared to align as if continents might once have fit together. Mountain ranges on opposite sides of oceans shared similar structures. Fossils appeared across separated lands in patterns that hinted at movement rather than disappearance. The idea that continents themselves could move was radical and deeply uncomfortable, but it slowly gained traction. If land could drift, then lost continents were no longer required. Lemuria's foundation began to weaken. While Western scientists debated these ideas, an entirely different narrative existed, far from European laboratories. In the southern reaches of India, ancient Tamil literature spoke of a homeland lost to the sea. This land was called Kumari Kandam, a vast southern territory believed to have existed beyond the current coastline. Tamil texts described floods that swallowed cities, forced migrations northward, and erased entire cultural centers. These were not framed as scientific hypotheses, but as memories preserved through poetry, oral tradition, and historical myth. To Western scholars, such stories were folklore and nothing more. Yet the parallels were difficult to ignore. Both Lemuria and Kumari Kandam pointed toward the same region of the world. Both described land that no longer existed. Both explained absence through loss rather than coincidence. One story was born in museums and universities, the other in ancient songs and collective memory. As the 19th century progressed, Lemuria stood at a crossroads between acceptance and extinction. It had emerged not as fantasy, but as an intellectual response to genuine scientific confusion. It filled gaps in knowledge at a time when the Earth itself was still poorly understood. But as new theories approached and technology promised clearer answers, Lemuria's days as a scientific solution were numbered. What began as a quiet hypothesis would soon transform, evolving beyond science into mythology, nationalism, mysticism, and conspiracy. Yet at its origin, Lemuria was simply an idea born from ignorance, curiosity, and the human discomfort with unanswered questions. The ocean kept its secrets, and in that silence, humanity imagined what must have been lost beneath the waves. As the 19th century advanced, the scientific world stood on unstable ground. New discoveries were arriving faster than explanations could keep up. Fossils were being unearthed across continents, species distributions challenged long-held beliefs, and the young theory of evolution was struggling to answer questions it had unintentionally created. At the center of this intellectual tension stood Charles Darwin. Though often portrayed as a man with complete answers, Darwin himself lived surrounded by uncertainty. His theory of natural selection explained how life changed over time, but it did not fully explain how similar life forms appeared on lands separated by vast oceans. Darwin was cautious, almost painfully so. He avoided public speculation where evidence was thin. Yet in private correspondence, he acknowledged the troubling gaps in biogeography. When colleagues discussed lost land bridges and sunken continents, Darwin did not laugh them away. He understood why such ideas were necessary. Without moving continents, evolution required geography to change instead. Lemuria quietly benefited from this hesitation. It existed not because Darwin endorsed it, but because he could not yet disprove it. Victorian science was deeply conservative in structure, even as it produced revolutionary ideas. Scholars worked within rigid assumptions inherited from earlier centuries. One of these assumptions was that continents were ancient, immobile, and permanent. Mountains might rise, seas might flood, but entire continents drifting across the planet sounded absurd. The Earth was thought to cool and contract like a drying apple, forming wrinkles that became mountains. In such a world, sinking land seemed far more believable than wandering land. Lemuria fit neatly into this worldview. It allowed scientists to preserve fixed continents while explaining biological puzzles. As evolutionary theory gained acceptance, the need for Lemuria actually increased. The more scientists studied life, the stranger its distribution appeared. Fossils of similar plants appeared in India, Africa, and Australia. Reptiles from prehistoric eras seemed to have relatives scattered across the southern continents. These patterns suggested connection, not coincidence. Without continental drift, the only remaining answer was disappearance. Lemuria became one of several proposed lost lands, but it was the most famous, the most discussed, and the most geographically ambitious. It stretched across imagination as much as across the Indian Ocean. During this period, scientific journals referenced Lemuria casually, as if its existence were merely awaiting confirmation. It was taught as a possibility, not a certainty, but also not a myth. The absence of direct evidence was not considered fatal. Much of the Earth remained unexplored, and the ocean floor was an alien world beyond reach. No one had yet mapped its depths in detail. No one knew what lay beneath kilometers of water. In that ignorance, Lemuria survived. But science evolves by eliminating comfortable ideas, not preserving them. Toward the end of the 19th century, cracks widened. Some geologists began questioning whether the Earth's crust was truly rigid. Alfred Wegener, a German meteorologist, would later notice that continents seemed to fit together like broken fragments of a single whole. Coastlines matched not just in shape, but in geological structure. Mountain ranges continued across oceans as if severed by force. Fossil evidence supported this unsettling pattern, though Wegener's theory of continental drift would not gain acceptance until decades later. Its shadow already loomed. If continents moved, Lemuria was unnecessary. Worse, it became impossible. A continent could not simply sink without leaving massive geological scars. Meanwhile, advancements in oceanography slowly eroded Lemuria's foundation. Early depth measurements suggested that the Indian Ocean floor was far deeper than expected. If Lemuria had existed as a massive continent, remnants of continental crust should have been detectable. Instead, the seafloor appeared primarily basaltic, characteristic of oceanic crust rather than continental land. These findings were incomplete and imprecise, but they planted doubt. Lemuria began to feel like an outdated solution clinging to a dying framework. Yet as science prepared to abandon Lemuria, something unexpected happened. The idea escaped the laboratory. Outside strict academic circles, Lemuria transformed. Writers, philosophers, and spiritual thinkers encountered the concept and saw something more than a land bridge. They saw mystery. They saw a lost world. One of the most influential figures in this transformation was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky absorbed Lemuria and reshaped it entirely. In her writings, Lemuria was no longer a mere continent, but the birthplace of ancient root races, spiritual beings, and forgotten knowledge. She claimed Lemuria predated Atlantis and housed civilizations far older than recorded history. These ideas had no scientific basis, but they resonated deeply with audiences searching for meaning beyond materialism. Lemuria became sacred rather than scientific. This shift complicated its legacy. While scientists quietly discarded Lemuria, the public embraced it with renewed enthusiasm. The idea of a lost continent offered answers to questions science could not address. Where did humanity come from? Why do myths of floods appear across cultures? Why does the past feel fragmented? Lemuria filled emotional and philosophical gaps even as it failed scientific ones. In India, the concept intersected with existing narratives. Tamil scholars and cultural leaders connected Lemuria to Kumari Kandam, framing it as proof that ancient Tamil civilization predated all others. Lemuria became a symbol of cultural pride, loss, and historical injustice. Colonial dismissal of indigenous histories fueled this reinterpretation. If Western science could imagine lost continents to solve its problems, why dismiss local traditions that spoke of the same loss? Thus, Lemuria became many things at once: a rejected scientific hypothesis, a spiritual homeland, a nationalist symbol, and a mythological stage. By the early 20th century, mainstream geology had effectively buried Lemuria. Plate tectonics emerged as a unifying theory, explaining continental movement, mountain formation, earthquakes, and biological distribution without the need for vanished continents. Lemuria was no longer necessary. It was labeled obsolete, yet it was never truly erased. Ideas rarely die when they capture imagination. Lemuria retreated into the margins, waiting. It survived in books, whispered in alternative histories, revived in esoteric teachings, and eventually reborn in the digital age. Its transformation revealed something essential about humanity. We do not abandon ideas simply because they are disproven. We abandon them only when we no longer need them. Lemuria's scientific role ended, but its psychological role had only begun. It remained a mirror reflecting human discomfort with loss, silence, and the unknown depths beneath our feet. As science moved forward, Lemuria drifted backward into myth, not because it was proven false, but because it had already evolved into something science could no longer contain. As Lemuria faded from the halls of Western science, it did not disappear everywhere. In South Asia, particularly in the Tamil-speaking regions of southern India and Sri Lanka, the idea of a lost land did not feel speculative or newly imagined. It felt remembered. Long before European scientists debated sunken continents, Tamil literature spoke of a vast southern homeland consumed by the sea. This land was known as Kumari-Kandam, a place described not through geological diagrams, but through poetry, legend, and historical consciousness. Ancient Tamil texts, including Sangam literature, referred to territories that once extended far south of the present coastline, lands where early Tamil civilization flourished before catastrophic floods forced migration northward. These stories were not framed as myth in the modern sense, but as part of a continuous cultural memory passed down across generations. When Lemuria entered Indian intellectual circles during the colonial period, it was immediately linked to Kumari-Kandam. To many Tamil scholars, Lemuria was not a hypothesis, but validation. Western science had unknowingly rediscovered what Tamil tradition had preserved all along. This convergence gave Lemuria a second life, one deeply entangled with identity, heritage, and resistance. Under British colonial rule, Indian histories were often dismissed or minimized, portrayed as derivative or primitive. The idea that an ancient Tamil civilization might predate known civilizations challenged colonial narratives of progress and superiority. Kumari-Kandam became a symbol of lost greatness, not merely geological loss, but cultural erasure. Writers and thinkers argued that floods had destroyed libraries, cities, and knowledge systems long before recorded history, explaining why Tamil antiquity seemed invisible to archaeology. Lemuria provided a convenient framework for this loss. It offered a geographical explanation for why evidence was missing. If the land itself had vanished beneath the ocean, then absence became proof rather than weakness. As the 20th century progressed, this idea spread beyond academic debate into popular imagination. Tamil nationalist movements embraced Kumari-Kandam as a golden age, portraying it as the cradle of language, culture, and even humanity itself. Some narratives claimed Tamil was the first human language spoken across Lemuria before its destruction scattered people across the world. These claims were not supported by linguistics or genetics, but they carried emotional power. Lemuria was no longer about animals or fossils. It was about dignity, continuity, and survival. The sea had not merely swallowed land, it had swallowed recognition. Meanwhile, similar flood myths appeared across cultures, reinforcing belief rather than skepticism. From Mesopotamian tales of Utnapishtim to the biblical story of Noah, from Greek accounts of Deucalion to Southeast Asian legends of drowned kingdoms, humanity seemed obsessed with water as a destroyer of worlds. Supporters of Lemuria argued that these myths were distorted memories of real events, echoes of a global catastrophe that erased ancient civilizations. In this context, Lemuria and Atlantis became siblings, different names for the same lost truth. While Atlantis was placed in the Atlantic and associated with Greek philosophy, Lemuria belonged to the Indian Ocean and the global south. One was claimed by Europe, the other by Asia. This division itself reflected deeper cultural tensions. Scientific rejection did little to weaken these beliefs, because Lemuria now served a different purpose. It explained emotional truths rather than empirical ones. It gave shape to the feeling that history was incomplete, that something important had been forgotten. Oceanography and plate tectonics could explain how continents moved, but they could not explain why stories of loss were so universal. Lemuria filled that gap. It became a container for everything erased by time, lost knowledge, lost languages, lost civilizations. As underwater exploration advanced, discoveries both fueled and frustrated believers. Submerged structures such as Adam's Bridge, also known as Rama Setu, stretching between India and Sri Lanka, were cited as evidence of ancient land connections. Though geologists explain these formations as natural limestone shoals shaped by currents and sediment, popular narratives describe them as remnants of Lemuria or proof of advanced prehistoric engineering. Satellite images circulated online, detached from scientific context, reinforcing belief. The ocean, once silent, now spoke through pixels, and interpretation replaced evidence. Lemuria's story adapted to each new technological age. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the internet accelerated this transformation. Online forums, videos, and alternative history channels revived Lemuria with renewed intensity. Claims grew more elaborate. Lemuria became the birthplace of humanity, home to giants, psychically advanced beings, or technologically superior civilizations destroyed by sudden cataclysm. Each retelling moved further from Sclater's original idea, yet retained its name, borrowing scientific legitimacy while rejecting scientific discipline. Lemuria became a word that meant whatever the storyteller needed it to mean. This evolution reveals a deeper truth about myth-making. Myths are not lies, they are responses. When official narratives feel incomplete or exclusionary, alternative histories emerge. Lemuria thrived not because of evidence, but because of dissatisfaction. It offered a story where marginalized cultures were central rather than peripheral. It suggested that modern civilization was not the pinnacle of human achievement, but the fragment of something far older. To critics, this was dangerous pseudoscience. To believers, it was justice. Science, however, remained unmoved. Geological surveys of the Indian Ocean showed no trace of a sunken continent of continental crust. Plate tectonics explained biological distribution through drifting landmasses rather than sinking ones. Genetic studies traced human migration patterns without requiring lost homelands beneath the sea. Lemuria, as a physical place, had no measurable footprint, yet its absence did not weaken its presence. It existed in books, speeches, songs, and increasingly in visual media. It existed as atmosphere rather than location. What Lemuria represented mattered more than whether it existed. It represented the fear that history forgets more than it remembers, that civilizations can vanish without trace, that oceans erase as efficiently as they preserve. In this sense, Lemuria became timeless. It was no longer bound to the Indian Ocean. It became an idea that could surface anywhere humans felt disconnected from their past. As science advanced, Lemuria retreated deeper into symbolism, but symbolism proved harder to sink than continents. The story of Kumari Kandam and Lemuria merged into a single narrative of loss and resilience, science and memory, rejection and rebirth. One began as hypothesis, the other as heritage, and together they formed a myth too powerful to discard. Lemuria no longer needed proof. It needed belief. And belief, unlike land, does not sink. It drifts, reshapes itself, and survives in the minds of those who need it. As we move forward, Lemuria's journey will take a darker turn, one where myth intersects with misuse, where lost continents become tools for ideology, power, and distortion. The question will no longer be whether Lemuria existed, but how far humans are willing to take the idea of a lost world when it serves their desires. As Lemuria moved further away from science and deeper into myth, it entered a phase that was no longer harmless. Ideas, once detached from evidence, become tools, and tools can be used in ways their creators never intended. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lost continents became fertile ground for occult movements, racial theories, and ideological fantasies. Lemuria, already reshaped by theosophy and nationalist reinterpretations, now attracted those searching not for history, but for superiority. Helena Blavatsky's writings had transformed Lemuria into the home of ancient root races, beings who were described as spiritually advanced and closer to cosmic truth than modern humans. Though Blavatsky framed these races as stages of spiritual evolution rather than biological hierarchies, her language was easily misinterpreted and deliberately distorted. The vague descriptions allowed later thinkers to inject their own prejudices into the narrative. In Europe, where pseudoscientific racial theories were already flourishing, Lemuria became entangled with dangerous ideas. Some occult writers claimed that Lemurians were the ancestors of certain modern populations, selectively elevating specific groups while dismissing others as degenerate remnants. The lost continent became a blank slate upon which fantasies of purity and origin could be written. This was not unique to Lemuria. Atlantis suffered a similar fate, but Lemuria's association with the East made it especially attractive to those seeking to rewrite global history around racial myths. As the 20th century progressed, these ideas found their way into extremist ideologies. In Germany, occult interest in ancient civilizations was not fringe curiosity, but part of a broader obsession with origins, destiny, and mythic pasts. While Atlantis was more frequently invoked, Lemuria appeared in esoteric literature as a possible cradle of an ancient-like race, supposedly possessing superior knowledge and power. These claims had no scientific basis and ignored the fact that Lemuria had been scientifically rejected decades earlier. But evidence was irrelevant. What mattered was narrative. Lost continents provided a way to bypass real history and replace it with imagined ancestry, one that justified conquest and exclusion. Lemuria, once a zoological hypothesis, became complicit in ideological violence, not because of what it was, but because of what it could be made to represent. This misuse highlights a recurring pattern in human thought. When history does not support belief, belief invents its own history. Lost lands are particularly useful because they cannot defend themselves. No ruins can contradict the storyteller. No surviving population can challenge the claim. The ocean becomes a convenient grave for inconvenient facts. After World War II, the association between occult pseudoscience and extremist ideology discredited many alternative history movements. Lemuria retreated again, this time into quieter corners of popular culture. Yet it never disappeared. Instead, it mutated. In the post-war world, spiritual movements stripped Lemuria of overt racial hierarchy and reframed it as a peaceful, enlightened civilization destroyed by natural disaster rather than moral decay. New Age philosophies adopted Lemuria as a symbol of harmony between humanity and nature. Lemurians were portrayed as gentle beings, telepathic, compassionate, and environmentally balanced. Their destruction was cast as a warning rather than a tragedy, a lesson about technological arrogance and spiritual imbalance. This version of Lemuria reflected contemporary anxieties about nuclear war, environmental collapse, and alienation. A lost continent became a mirror once again, reflecting the fears of the age. In parallel, academic archaeology and geology continued to advance. Sonar mapping, deep-sea drilling, and satellite data revealed the structure of the ocean floor in unprecedented detail. The Indian Ocean showed no trace of a sunken continental mass, matching Lemuria's description. Instead, it revealed mid-ocean ridges, tectonic boundaries, and fragments of microcontinents, like the Seychelles and the Kerguelen Plateau. These fragments were sometimes misrepresented by Lemuria proponents as evidence, but scientists explained them as remnants of ancient continental breakup, not drowned supercontinents. Ironically, these discoveries strengthened belief rather than weakening it. Each fragment became proof in the eyes of believers, even when explained otherwise. This highlighted a fundamental divide between scientific reasoning and mythic thinking. Science asks whether evidence supports a claim. Myth asks whether a claim feels meaningful. Lemuria survived because it answered emotional needs science does not address. It provided a sense of origin beyond recorded history, a sense of loss that validated cultural grief, and a sense of mystery in an age increasingly defined by data. However, the darker uses of Lemuria never fully vanished. Online spaces allowed old racial theories to re-emerge under new disguises. Claims about ancient superior civilizations were repackaged, stripped of explicit hate, and presented as curiosity-driven exploration. Algorithms rewarded sensationalism, not caution. Lemuria became clickable. Titles promised hidden truths, suppressed history, and forbidden knowledge. In this environment, the line between entertainment and misinformation blurred. What began as storytelling hardened into belief for some audiences. The lost continent became a tool once more, shaping worldviews rather than reflecting them. This evolution forces a difficult question. Does the harm come from the idea itself or from how it is used? Lemuria, in its original form, was an honest attempt to explain biological puzzles. It became dangerous only when stripped of context and discipline. Yet ideas cannot control their afterlives. Once released, they belong to everyone. Lemuria's journey from hypothesis to myth to ideology demonstrates how knowledge transforms when removed from its foundations. It reveals the human tendency to prefer stories that empower identity over explanations that demand humility. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Lemuria entered its final form, not as land, not as civilization, but as content. It lived in videos, forums, and endless retellings, each version further from the original, each shaped by the desires of its audience. To some, Lemuria was proof of hidden truth. To others, it was harmless fantasy. To scientists, it remained a cautionary tale. The lost continent had not been found beneath the sea, but it had surfaced within the human mind, revealing how easily curiosity can become conviction and how quickly mystery can be weaponized. As we move toward the conclusion of this epic, Lemuria must be confronted not as geography, but as a question about ourselves. Why do we cling to lost worlds? Why do we resist letting certain ideas die? And what does Lemuria's persistence say about the boundaries between science, myth, and belief?
By the mid-20th century, science had reached a turning point that would permanently change humanity's understanding of the Earth. The mystery that once allowed Lemuria to exist was no longer ignorance, but evidence. New technologies did what imagination could not. They revealed the hidden architecture of the planet itself. The development of sonar during World War II allowed scientists to map the ocean floor in detail for the first time. What emerged was not the smooth, sunken plateau of a lost continent, but a rugged landscape of ridges, trenches, and fractures. The Indian Ocean revealed mid-ocean ridges where new crust was forming, and deep basins composed of dense basalt rather than lighter continental rock. This distinction mattered. Continental crust and oceanic crust are fundamentally different in composition and density. A continent like Lemuria, if it had existed and sunk, would have left behind unmistakable geological evidence. That evidence was absent. Instead, the ocean floor told a different story, one of motion rather than disappearance. Plate tectonics emerged as the unifying theory that explained everything Lemuria once tried to explain. Continents were not fixed. They drifted slowly atop molten mantle. They collided, split apart, and reshaped the surface of the planet over millions of years. This single insight dissolved the need for lost continents almost overnight. The distribution of lemurs no longer required a sunken land bridge. India itself had once been part of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, connected to Madagascar before drifting northward and colliding with Asia. Lemurs traveled when land was joined, not
when it sank. Fossils found across southern continents made sense within this framework. They were not separated by catastrophe but by time. As plate tectonics gained acceptance, Lemuria was quietly removed from textbooks. There was no dramatic announcement, no official funeral. It simply became unnecessary. Science moved on, yet the story did not end there. Modern discoveries complicated the narrative in subtle ways. While no evidence supported a massive sunken continent, researchers did identify fragments of continental crust scattered beneath the Indian Ocean. Microcontinents such as the Seychelles Plateau and submerged landmasses like Mauritia, near Mauritius, were remnants of ancient continental breakup. These findings were precise, limited, and well documented, but to non-specialists, they sounded suspiciously like confirmation. Headlines spoke of hidden continents, blurring the line between technical geology and myth. Believers seized upon these discoveries as proof that Lemuria had existed after all, ignoring scale and context. A microcontinent is not a lost world. It is a fragment, not a civilization. Science clarified, but myth amplified. At the same time, underwater archaeology advanced public fascination with submerged ruins. Rising sea levels after the last ice age had indeed flooded coastal settlements across the world. Evidence of ancient human habitation beneath shallow seas appeared near India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. These discoveries were real, measurable, and limited to coastal regions, but they fed a broader narrative of drowned worlds. Lemuria absorbed these findings effortlessly. Each submerged structure became another.
Hint, another suggestion that history lay hidden beneath water. The difference between localized flooding and continental collapse blurred in popular imagination. Science explained process. Myth preferred spectacle. In the digital age, this gap widened. Online platforms rewarded certainty over nuance. Videos framed Lemuria as suppressed truth, plate tectonics as a cover story, and academic consensus as conspiracy. The lost continent became an icon of distrust toward institutions. For some, rejecting Lemuria felt like surrendering imagination to authority. Yet modern science did not seek to destroy wonder. It revealed a world far more dynamic than early thinkers imagined. Continents drifted thousands of kilometers. Mountains rose from collisions. Oceans opened and closed. Earth itself was restless. In this context, Lemuria was not wrong because it imagined change, but because it misunderstood how change occurred. The planet did not erase continents wholesale. It reshaped them slowly. Time, not catastrophe, was the dominant force. Understanding this required patience, something myth rarely demands. The final verdict on Lemuria, then, is not a simple dismissal. Lemuria was a stepping stone, an idea born from limited data and honest curiosity. It represented a moment when science stood at the edge of knowledge and filled the void with hypothesis. Its later transformations reveal how ideas escape their origins and acquire meanings their creators never intended. Lemuria became myth because it addressed emotional needs science does not prioritize. Belonging, origin, loss, and mystery. It became dangerous when used to justify exclusion and superiority. It became popular again because modern audiences crave stories that challenge official narratives. Yet beneath all versions lies the same truth. Lemuria as a continent did not exist. Lemuria, as an idea, never stopped existing. It reminds us that science is not a collection of eternal truths, but a process of correction. Yesterday's solutions become today's mistakes, and today's certainty may become tomorrow's footnote. Lemuria's rise and fall illustrate how knowledge advances by abandoning what once seemed obvious. It also reveals the cost of abandoning ideas without explaining why. When science moves forward silently, myth fills the gap. The ocean floor no longer hides a lost continent, but human imagination continues to search its depths. Lemuria survives as a cautionary tale and a cultural artifact, a symbol of how easily curiosity transforms into conviction. It asks us to consider not only what we believe, but why we believe it. In the end, the most important question Lemuria raises is not geological, but human. Are we more comfortable with stories of sudden loss than with slow change? Do we prefer hidden worlds to complex explanations? The answer determines whether Lemuria remains a footnote in history or a recurring shadow in the future. A lost continent was never found beneath the sea, but its legacy remains embedded in how humanity navigates the boundary between wonder and evidence, between memory and measurement, between what we wish had been and what the Earth itself reveals. Even after science delivered its verdict, Lemuria refused to disappear. Ideas that vanish completely are usually those that never mattered. Lemuria mattered because it answered questions science was slow to ask and even slower to explain to the public. In the modern world, where information is abundant but trust is fragile, Lemuria found fertile ground for revival. The internet did not create belief in lost continents. It amplified it. Platforms built on engagement rewarded certainty, mystery, and emotional impact over caution and complexity. Lemuria returned not as a hypothesis, but as content. It became a symbol of hidden history, a narrative that promised forbidden knowledge in a world saturated with official explanations. Videos, articles, and forums framed Lemuria as truth suppressed by institutions, turning absence of evidence into evidence of suppression. This reversal of logic was powerful because it resonated with a broader cultural mood. Many people felt disconnected from authority, skeptical of expertise, and dissatisfied with narratives that seemed incomplete or impersonal. Lemuria thrived in this atmosphere because it offered something modern life often lacks: depth, antiquity, and meaning. It suggested that humanity's story was not linear progress, but cyclical loss, that civilizations rise and fall, and that modern society might not be as advanced as it believes. This idea was comforting and unsettling at the same time. Psychologically, Lemuria functions as a memory of something humanity fears it has lost, even if that memory was never real. It embodies nostalgia for a past that feels wiser, more harmonious, and less fragmented than the present. In this sense, Lemuria is less about geology and more about longing. The ocean becomes a metaphor for everything forgotten, everything erased by time, modernization, and cultural dominance, for communities whose histories were disrupted by colonialism, migration, or conquest. Lemuria offers symbolic restoration. It suggests that erasure was not due to insignificance, but catastrophe. Something valuable existed and was taken away by forces beyond control. This framing transforms loss into dignity. At the same time, Lemuria appeals to those who feel alienated by scientific language. Modern science is precise, but often inaccessible. It demands acceptance of processes that unfold over millions of years, scales that are difficult to emotionally grasp. Lemuria offers immediacy: a sudden flood, a drowned world, a clear before and after. Human minds prefer narratives with sharp edges. Gradual change feels unsatisfying. This preference explains why catastrophic myths persist across cultures. They provide emotional clarity, where reality offers ambiguity. Lemuria survives because it aligns with how humans intuitively understand loss. In the age of YouTube, this intuition becomes monetized. Long-form videos, calm narration, and mysterious themes create immersive experiences that blur the line between education and storytelling. Lemuria fits perfectly into this format. It is complex enough to feel intellectual, vague enough to invite interpretation, and controversial enough to provoke discussion. Viewers do not come only for answers. They come for atmosphere. Lemuria provides atmosphere in abundance. It allows creators to explore science, myth, psychology, and philosophy without fully committing to any one domain. This flexibility ensures its survival. Yet beneath entertainment lies responsibility. Stories shape perception. When Lemuria is presented without context, it risks reinforcing distrust in knowledge rather than curiosity about it. But when presented honestly, as a journey of human understanding, it becomes something richer. Lemuria then serves as a lesson rather than a lie. It teaches how science evolves, how mistakes are not failures but steps, and how imagination fills gaps before evidence arrives. It reveals how cultures preserve memory differently, how myth and science serve different needs, and how both can coexist without replacing one another. The true value of Lemuria lies here, not in whether it existed, but in what its story reveals about us. Lemuria shows that humans are uncomfortable with emptiness. When faced with blank spaces on maps, in history, or in identity, we fill them. Sometimes with hypotheses, sometimes with poetry, sometimes with ideology. The danger arises not from filling gaps, but from refusing to revise what we fill them with. Science revises itself constantly. Myth revises itself symbolically. Problems emerge when one pretends to be the other. Lemuria's long journey from zoology to mythology to digital folklore traces this tension clearly. It reminds us that wonder does not disappear when ideas are corrected. It simply changes shape. The ocean floor turned out to be less romantic than imagined, but far more dynamic. Continents drifted like slow-moving thoughts across geological time. Life adapted not through catastrophe alone, but through persistence. This reality is quieter than myth, but no less profound. In the end, Lemuria stands as a ghost continent, not beneath the sea, but within human culture. It is a shadow cast by curiosity, fear, pride, and hope. It is a reminder that every generation inherits unanswered questions and chooses how.